Oh, good morning. Thank you, Jordi, for the introduction. So I'm going to take you through, let me see, I have my disclosures, 10 seconds. Okay, 6 seconds. So learning objectives. So I want to really give you a framework and then try and put EBMT into that framework as well. Okay. So I would like to say thank you to the EMA Patient Registry Initiative team, specifically Xavier Kurtz, who very generously shared a very recent slide set with me for this. So consequently, some of these slides are just mere adaptations from the original EMA. Any changes are my responsibility. Okay. So the question is, why is the European Medicines Agency actually discussing registries? And essentially they had a problem. And the problem was that these new therapies defied all of their normal rules. These were not tablets that came out of a nice GMP plant, one identical to the other, etc. Suddenly they had cells, living cells, which were now considered drugs, and they really needed a new solution for this. And that's one part. The second part is that the typical scenario with an authorization is that the manufacturer often creates the registry themselves. So you now have a product registry. And it's maintained for the duration of the authorization, post-authorization requirements. They also looked around and they saw that there were existing registries. And many times these were patient or / disease registries. And they could see a utility in terms of the extent of the data and also the possibility for comparing previous treatment or classic regimes against perhaps new ones as well. So those two things were happening around the same time. What they also saw when they looked at these disease registries was a series of challenges. So in some cases, physicians didn't engage with them. You probably all know in your own institution that an individual has developed a registry for his or her study, and as soon as that individual finishes or leaves or passes away, that registry disappears with them as well. Data quality can be very variable. We've had a question already about that. The actual representativeness of that data for a patient population, again, wide variability and variability in data completeness as well. And then one of the main challenges, and related to perhaps individuals with their own registries, was sustainability. Both whoever is driving it and then the infrastructure needed to maintain it. Essentially funding. Where is the money coming from to maintain and develop? So as they further developed this strategy around patient registries and what they call the Patient Registry Initiative, essentially this side here, the left side and the bottom, that was quite typical to have. You typically had regulators talking to industry and industry talking to academia. What they wanted to do was to bring up on this right side an engagement between the regulator and the registry holder / academia. So that would be EBMT. We are a registry holder and we're described as academia as a collective. So they wanted to promote that dialogue and actually get people talking together, and also doing it as part of the authorization process as well. So this is not something isolated, maybe in parallel. This is trying to knit this part here into the authorization process itself. So in 2015, EMA launched this. They launched what they called a cross-committee task force, and they began really reaching out to people. In our case, we did the opposite. We reached out to EMA. I mean, it was widely publicized. So we wrote a letter and we said, hey, we've got a registry. It's been around for 40 years. It's packed full of transplants. It might be interesting for you. And that led then to a phone call. It led then to an invitation, I think, to this workshop meeting in 2016. And things accelerated quite a lot then in 2017. Why? Because CAR-Ts were coming down the line in terms of authorization. And again, if you have the Medicines Agency trying to scan ahead, they know what products are coming, they're already starting to think of what we're going to need for afterwards. This timing, there's nothing casual about this. This is all interrelated. So most significantly, and Carmen already mentioned this was the event in 2018, which was a workshop for registries. And this was hosted by EMA. As I say, I think there were maybe 60 people at that particular meeting. And it was the third, because they had already done the previous year, they had done one for cystic fibrosis and one for multiple sclerosis. Why? Because, again, there were drugs coming up to EMA for these conditions as well. And then in June they did hemophilia. Incidentally, there are reports published on the website. You can get the CAR-T report and read all of the proceedings from that, including all the detail of the must-haves and the nice-to-haves and the should-haves, etc., etc. So these are EMA's lessons that they drew from all of those registries workshops. So that's 4 that they've actually done. So common data elements, core data elements. So this is a consensus on what we really need to have, okay? And this essential difference between the must-haves and the nice-to-have as well. And then registries were able to say as well, yes, technically we can always add more items, okay? But I'll come back to that. And Carmen has already alluded to this idea of, yes, we can, but these people have to have time to fill it out, okay? But that's not just, it's probably essential that the regulator and also the manufacturer knows that this is not written in stone, that the registry has the capacity to add additional data items as well. In terms of data quality, so we've gone beyond, if you like, the origins of the registry, which was very much for the community to do science, and the community could tolerate perhaps maybe a wider variability in quality. Doesn't want it, but perhaps can understand why it might happen. This changes in the context of marketing authorizations, and a word we'll use is post-authorization safety studies, the PAS. And the elements that came out of this were key components: uniformity, representativeness, consistency, completeness, accuracy, timeliness. Data source verification procedure, aka audits at source as well. That there is a quality control system internally, and then very strongly encouraged to submit ourselves to some sort of external check as well, so that somebody would come and from outside and actually look at how we're running the registry. All of which is to give confidence to the user, whether it's government agency, ministry, the sponsor, etc., that what's collected is accurate. And then the quality indicators to be defined. And then this here at the bottom, that there is no great disparity between normal use data and studies use data, okay? So that there is a consistent minimum level of quality regardless of the use as well. And then governance. And governance, I would say, within this principle, worry was probably access, data sharing and access to the registry as well. But apart from that, you have the idea of engaging, and if you go back to that triangle with the arrows, is that pharma, regulators and the registry holders are really having those conversations much earlier on. Maybe Anya will touch on this, but our experience has always shown that if a marketing authorization holder suddenly has a brilliant idea 6 months into a process of what else they would like to have, it can be very disruptive and can have a significant impact. So we've always said the earlier the better, okay? And basically want to have a consistent way of actually satisfying data requests, centralized, and that it's subject to a transparent policy, that it's clear who can access what data and how, okay? That's the data sharing as well. And then collection and processing of adverse events. Now, for a registry holder, it's not typically an activity, pharmacovigilance is not, it's not something that we want to do. It's not something that we do. We have done it as part of the clinical trials that EBMT have run themselves, where we have been the sponsor. But typically, the registry is not for collecting spontaneous patient safety reporting. That is something that goes through a different channel. However, we can collect, after the fact, we can collect that kind of data in the registry. It can be recorded, it can be then used for aggregate reports, which can be perhaps requested by a EMA or a national agency, etc. So it's a capacity for collecting some of that data, but not acting as the pharmacovigilance system. So that's all of that is what EMA was seeing when they looked at patient registries. Again, needing a solution to a problem that they were already seeing. So in the context of EBMT, if you like, this is what we told them we can do. And this is a 2017 paper, which, if you like, demonstrated the idea of the registry as an ecosystem. In this case, they checked, I think it was for maybe 8 or 9 different drugs, impact on transplant by going to the registry, checking when something was introduced or began to be standard of care. I think the only one which is impacted was imatinib, which I don't think the graph is there, but anyway, I mean, that paper, I think, maybe even open access. So this was a great example of the utility of a registry like the EBMT registry for actually seeing changes in the technology, in treatment, in practice, etc. And then increasingly, we're now talking in the context of CAR-Ts about long-term follow-up, okay? And I think it's something that, I mean, when I started in EBMT, early 2000s, I don't think there was I'm not sure it was a late effects working party back then, but certainly as a concept there was, yeah? Yes. But then they kept changing the name, no? I certainly have a sense that we talk about late effects and complications much more than we did back then. And I would have said that follow-up has increasingly become, or it has always been in our DNA. And suddenly it's been talked about in a different context. It's been talked about by people like EMA and been talked about with numbers, which is 15 years in the case of the CAR-Ts. Plus, with all of the, you could call it hype, but certainly excitement, interest, scientifically, commercially, socially, around a potentially high impact development like CAR-Ts. I mean, we have concerns. I mean, the concerns about toxicity, efficacy, complexity, costs, and costs then impact on access. And you can look up Google and put in CAR-T and you will get offers of CAR-Ts and then you will get criticism of CAR-T, etc. So this is all part of a much wider discussion around the impact of these drugs. So again, when we went back to EMA and we said, actually, you kind of know us already. You know, it's not like we just dropped out of the sky as far as you're concerned. You used us for Zalmoxis. Zalmoxis, the manufacturer was obliged to do a registry study. I think they had conditional authorization, so they followed up using it as a control arm for that study as well. I'm not sure if Zalmoxis, is it at the end yet? Did they finish that, or is it ongoing? Yeah. It's finished? Okay. And then this is a little bit different. Again, it's an EMA slide, but this is essentially the 2 commercial products now authorized. And in this case, what they realized was they didn't use the EBMT registry in the studies phases, but we fitted in here where we had potentially a role to play in the long-term follow-up, checking benefit risk through the registry as well. So there was, like I say, an awareness within EMA, which then became more accentuated in the context of these therapies. So in the last few years, I've seen what I think is a happy coincidence, which is the practitioners want to use these therapies for their patients. Many of them are originating in the institutions which are EBMT members. The manufacturers are also obviously investing large amounts of money in this. The regulators and the manufacturers both have an interest in reaching an agreement or a consensus on what is the best way to do follow-up. And increasingly, payers, whether it be private or public payers, are also very, very interested in data in this case. So with this happy coincidence, and the meeting that Carmen described had all of those people in the same room, I think it's this idea that maybe it's happened before, but I certainly had a sense that this is a very different approach that there is a level of engagement which is new, and that everybody is kind of feeling their way through a very new process as well. But in the middle of that is the data that's going to be collected on cell therapy, the existing data and then the new data as well. Just to skim through the process itself, and I can tell you that it's quite long. So, but what does this mean? EMA essentially, we've requested what we call a qualification opinion. Qualification opinion is asking EMA, do you agree that what we are doing is suitable for long-term follow-up of CAR-Ts? Okay. The process itself is kind of unusual. You write a series of questions, you answer it yourself, and then you ask them, is that okay? There's a lot of learning internally for EBMT to engage with this process. We are around here now. The last communication I had was that perhaps in the next week, the final opinion will be published. There is a draft opinion which is from late June, July last year, which is probably still on the website. I don't expect it to change very much, which means that it will be a positive opinion. I don't think they issue negative opinions, but if they have reservations, they call it advice, and it doesn't go to public consultation. So, if you like, this is now coming up to 3 years process. First of all, as I say, with those contacts, engaging slowly, and then building up to something far more formal in 2017, and hopefully, as I say, that in the next days even, we may actually have that. And that's important. Why? Because it will actually say, if you like, that yes, the EBMT registry is a suitable platform for collecting long-term follow-up data on recipients of these products. The wording is going to be very, very clear, specific, limited to one single activity. And it will not say, I don't think, that you have to, this is the only place you can do it. Any other registry could also go through the same process, ask for an opinion, go through the same engagement, dialogue, etc. But it will say, yes, this particular application, this particular tool is suitable. When we went into it, Carmen mentioned that we were at the same time, more or less. It coincided with the revamp of the registry, moving from Promise to Macro. And I think we very consciously went into this process, yes, desiring to achieve a qualification opinion. But I think we had a very good philosophy, which is that in the worst case scenario where this becomes an advice, they have reservations or whatever, the learning by submitting yourself to external scrutiny will be enormous. And especially at a time when you're developing a new and rolling out a new system, the timing in some ways was quite good. It generated a lot of extra work, that's true. But as I say, that the learning from having somebody outside with different needs, looking at your same platform is important as well. We're in a pilot process. We're following the cystic fibrosis. They got their positive opinion or qualification opinion in February 2018. So we will be the second. I'm guessing that multiple sclerosis may be in a process themselves. I'm not really sure. And the other significant part of this as well is that the HTA, so the Health Technology Assessment bodies, so these are the bodies in your countries who decide whether to pay for a drug or not, they observed the process. So again, like I say, so now we have a new stakeholder. We never talked to anybody from HTA before. But again, it's this realization that we have something to offer them. They have things that they maybe need from us as well. So they observed that. And what I think in the next few years is we'll see more engagement or dialogue with people like HTA. The network, which is a European network, the UNET HTA, or individual agencies and national agencies as well. Okay. Just to give you some examples, in CIBMTR in the United States, they signed an agreement with Kite for long-term follow-up. That was in May 17. And then, this is from December. In December, I knew that in Japan, they were anticipating maybe that they would be involved in those discussions. I think actually I saw something in the news about next week or something in Japan, they're going to make a decision about CAR-Ts, but I don't know exactly about the registry. But again, both are identical types of platforms, developed by the stem cell community for their own purposes, but then finding another utility for other stakeholders. And this is the tension that Carmen talked about, which we've seen throughout this process, not just in the workshop, but I think it's ongoing, it's continuous. What people want and what can be really conceivably, feasibly, realistically, practically, not expensively collected as well. I'm not sure, I think this will be something everybody will live with and have to live with, because I don't think it ever ends. And then if you're interested, you can get all of the information from the EMA website if you put in Patient Registry Initiative. There is an important discussion paper. So EMA, if you like, have taken their learning from the last 4 years or so, 3 years, put it all together in a discussion document and invited public consultation. Okay? The closing date is the 30th of June. It's an unusually long period because it coincides with the move of EMA, so there's a lot of disruption in EMA, so they've given a much longer period for input and for consultation. And there's also a paper, I think it's open, which was written by 4 people from the PRI, the Patient Registry Initiative in EMA, on using what they called imposed registries. Okay, so I think it stops in 2016-17, so it hasn't gotten as far as us. I'd be very interested to see if they do a follow-up. So EBMT's conclusions on this process. Source of learning, definitely it's part of a quality improvement. It can show us what we're doing well, and it can highlight maybe gaps or areas for improvement. The feedback consequently is not just valuable, invaluable. I think it's a win-win. Again, that scene of maybe 60 people in the same room engaging very, very positively in a process to get a consensus. And EBMT, I think, we could have made a decision not to go with this. We could have decided that this is going to be too much, it's the wrong moment, we're doing macro, perhaps next year, whatever. And I personally think it's good that we didn't. I think this process is happening now. I think it could look very different in 2 or 3 years' time. I think that by participating, we can help shape it, we can influence it, if you like, as well. So I think it's been, in spite of the effort, we've had to make extra effort. I think being in at this point, I think has been very important. EMA's conclusions, they certainly see a paradigm shift. This is what I was mentioning. The atmosphere seems to have changed, I think. They have concerns, and I think they're valid, about data quality and the need for qualification process, not just the EBMT, but in general, that these existing registries need to be subject to some sort of check process, certification, accreditation, qualification. There will always probably be gaps in needs because the origins of these registries is very, very different to what the intended use now, that the early interactions undoubtedly help and are strongly encouraged, and that they see a need that the European Union, at least regulatory network, tries to facilitate the use of these so that at least that the regulations don't become an obstacle to using these. So again, it's a very, very big picture. We're only a small part of it, but I think with this paradigm shift that EMA are talking about, the regulation or the regulatory network, whether formally just by people talking to each other, or whether ultimately maybe there's regulation coming, who knows, but that's the way it goes. And then I just want to quote Carmen. I borrowed this, she wrote an email to me and I thought it was great, and I said, can I use it? And I stuck it here because when I presented this, I presented it at a regulatory/industry meeting, and it's an important message. It's you have to look after your registry. It doesn't just switch on and is ready to go when you need it without doing that preparation. And preparation then, people, time, ultimately some funding, etc. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions or comments?
Thank you. A very fascinating story, and having worked with the EMA for a few years, I know a little bit about the situation there. So far, so good. Okay, let's see now. We get this next week. And I was actually at a meeting with the Swedish Medical Products Agency. That's why I wasn't here yesterday. Okay. And EBMT registry was mentioned, as the registry. So although it might probably based on the June opinion and not on the final one, it seems to be in there. Okay, but we all know that data collection and data quality poses major changes or challenges. And we have another mission, which is the transplant part, of course. How are we going to balance the need for whatever is going to be needed for change in the registry in the next couple of years between the transplant part, our research part, and our service part to companies, and for them to fulfill the requirements of the EMA?
I think it's a fundamental question. One thing I didn't say, and I should have mentioned this, I'll just go back a little bit. For the data managers in the room, what does all this mean? It means that you will be under even more pressure to report completely on these regulated products, because the manufacturers have to do this. This is not, as I said before, voluntary scientific interest. That changes the whole message here. This is now part of a regulatory system where the data is critical post-authorization. What you're mentioning, Per, I think is a question for the society as a whole. So my sensation is we've spent the last 3 years talking about nothing else but CAR-Ts. And CAR-Ts, Carmen mentioned it, in number terms, right now there will be a tiny part of our activity. For every CAR-T you register, and if you're in an allo center, you'll do 30 allos probably. I think that we're looking at a scenario where hopefully there will be some cross-pollination, that through running a service, which you've mentioned, which is the PASS, which Anya I think we'll talk about now, is that we can also sustain more fundamental scientific interests-driven research as well, the data for that. So there's a model where funding is coming in through the studies, but going back into the registry itself, which has to be maintained and developed, and then going into support maybe more basic science, or simply areas where there is an industry interest, and it's something that has to be done through academia. My sense is that we're moving certainly from being a bone marrow. We still have bone marrow, I think, in our name, European. Well, no, it's blood and marrow, but marrow is still there. I think that essence has to be preserved. I don't know if we have to put cellular therapy in the name of the society as well somewhere too. In France, they put TC at the end of the name to add to cellular therapy. Maybe we have to do that. I don't know. I think that it's something that takes place at leadership. I've heard Nicholas Kruger say this, that we shouldn't lose sight of our main mission, and it's science for patients. Whether it's very exciting new stuff or whether it's old hat classic transplant and improving that. I don't know if Carmen has a view on future of the registry. I'd like to think so, even though you're leaving.
Owen, I saw that the CIBMTR has an agreement for long-term follow-up. And in the case of Europe, are companies going to accept the short-term results, or will they also just agree on long-term follow-up, but they want to have their own databases?
Well, the long term will be imposed by EMA, by the marketing authorization conditions. 15 years is what they're talking about. I don't think they want to have their own database as well. Well, for me at least, it doesn't make sense to duplicate. I think in parts, I'd like to think that the registry is a solution for them, not just imposed, but that it's standardized, etc. It can satisfy multiple needs. In the agreements, and Anya will talk about this perhaps, there will always be a data sharing clause in the contracts, not patient level, but aggregate data, because they can use that then for satisfying regulatory needs, probably not just with the EMA, but probably at national level as well. So the happy coincidence that I refer to, I think includes this. There's a certain efficiency by having just one solution used by everybody, and satisfying multiple needs from one source rather than maintaining different databases, different systems, not standardized, and ultimately not comparable. And comparability, everything that Carmen said about harmonization with CIBMTR, ultimately is so that we can compare not just data in Europe, but also with the US and ultimately with Japan, I guess, as well. So I'm not sure if anybody, any company in the room wants to comment on that. No. Okay.
We move on.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and